So one of the issues that was raised in Julie's statement is the role for solar, distributed and centralized. And when we talk about distributed and centralized, we're talking about, do we have renewables in a plant that's located somewhere, just like we have our coal and gas plants, and then that power is sent to where the demand is. That would be centralized. Distributed is having the power very closely located to where it's used, and that's like having rooftop solar. And first of all, there's pros and cons to both of those, or I would like pros and cons. There are advantages to both of those, distributed and centralized. So one advantage to centralized is that it's lower cost. And this is a real barrier, so I'll step back and say the biggest barrier to renewables is the cost. They're very expensive relative to traditional generation sources. So to give you some kind of ballpark understanding of expense, we would say that wind is a little bit more expensive than natural gas right now on an energy unit basis. Centralized solar, well, distributed solar, which is the rooftop PV, is actually 6 to 10 times more expensive than gas once you don't include any subsidies. Utility scale PV, which would be like the same panels on your roof, but put together in a centralized plant, that's 4 to 6 times the cost of natural gas power. And centralized solar is about 5 times. So we're talking about quite a difference in what we would have to pay in order to install these renewables. So centralized solar and centralized wind farms have the advantage of scale. You're able to build larger. There's some cost savings with that, kind of like the Costco idea that if you can get it in bulk, it's going to be cheaper. And that's a real benefit. But the difficulty is getting that power to where the demand is, getting the transmission. And we don't yet have sufficient transmission to get all the renewables that we need in order to meet our targets. And I'll speak more about transmission, I guess now actually, since that's where I am. So there are plans so the issue with transmission is, one, not everyone wants transmission lines in their backyard, because even though your power is green, your transmission lines are the same. Transmission is also very expensive. It can cost $2 to $4 million per mile of line. And it's not clear necessarily who should pay for it and when. And it's just not something that we've invested sufficiently in our society. So in order to take advantage of some of these renewables, we need to increase our transmission. Another issue potentially with centralized wind and solar is environmental siting issues. There are other concerns that come about from building large-scale power plants, regardless of what the fuel source is. Particularly, we think, for example, in the Mojave Desert, there was a legislation that was proposed recently by Senator Feinstein that would protect a certain part of the Mojave Desert. That amount of land that we protected would actually mean that approximately 10 to 13 wind and solar plants would not be built that were originally planned. And so how do we balance our desire to protect the environment with also having clean energy? Similarly, issues have developed here with the potential sun power plant related to environmental protection of a local species. There's also issues associated with other resources when we're siting centralized plants. So water usage. Where do you get water available in order to cool some of these plants? And transmission issues with just siting the transmission and environmental issues along those corridors. So that's centralized. So we have pros are lower cost and distributed, but still, how do we get that power to everyone? So why doesn't everything become distributed? Why don't we just have rooftop solar and backyard wind? Well, there's issues there. Those technologies are more expensive, they're more customized. It's a lot cheaper to put a solar power system on a new home than to retrofit it to an old home, because you're not having to make it fit in line with your existing roof or your structure. So if you think about a lot of distributed power is retrofit, and that's expensive versus just building it from the beginning. There's also issues with how that integrates into the grid as we have it now. Our electricity system is set up in a way where we have centralized plants and that power radiates out to our homes. It's a different model to think about providing that power on our individual roofs. And even then, none of these technologies will meet all of our energy needs. And this is a really important point. We're going to need a combination of all of these because renewables by nature are intermittent. They don't run all the time. And so what do we do when the sun goes out? Well, and this gets to the issue and the importance of system reliability. And the way in which, potential ways in which we can address the fact that renewables are not consistent is to support these with fossil fuel generation, such as gas plants. And so as we talk about renewables, we also need to think a lot about getting more efficient gas plants, because there's a range of emissions that come from natural gas plants. And we should be encouraging the most efficient plants to be used as a support system for potential wind, for potential solar. And Kathy will address some of the other issues, some of the other ways in which, because even though we can reduce emissions by reducing how much energy we supply, we can also reduce emissions by controlling how much energy we demand. And the final point I want to mention is the role for and need for storage. Because renewables are intermittent, we would like to sometimes save some of the energy we generate. So when the sun's shining bright, we overgenerate. How can we save that and use that later? And storage technology is constantly in development, is constantly improving, but still a lot of work needs to be done. And finally, from a research perspective, I will say that the wind technology, solar technologies, all these technologies are increasingly improving. The efficiency of solar has improved, the alternative technologies that we've developed, thin film solar versus crystalline is cheaper. And so I have a lot of faith that these technologies will become cheaper, and so some of these cost constraints will not be as large. The question is though, as we're trying to reduce carbon a massive amount in the next 20 years, what do we invest in and when do we do it? Do we wait till the technologies become cheaper but run the risk of not reducing our emissions? Or do we invest in more expensive technologies now and believe that they will eventually help us reach that goal? So I'll stop there and pass it along to Marisa again. Thank you.